It was meant to be the defining moment of Queen Camilla's life, the crown placed, the cameras flashing, the world watching. But inside Westminster Abbey, something felt off. Subtle glances were exchanged. Protocol lines blurred, and as the ceremony concluded, a quiet question began circulating among insiders. Had everything truly been done by the book, or had something been deliberately altered? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, nothing appeared unusual to the public eye. The coronation of Charles III and Camilla unfolded with all the grandeur expected of a moment that would define a generation of monarchy. The ancient rituals, the sacred vows, the symbolism layered into every movement, it all seemed intact. Yet beneath that polished surface, those familiar with the deep traditions of royal ceremonies began to notice something subtle, something difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. There were pauses that lingered just a second too long. There were sequences that seemed adjusted. And in a ceremony where precision is everything, even the smallest deviation can carry enormous meaning. Historically, the crowning of a queen consort follows a structure that has been preserved with near religious discipline. It is not merely a performance but a transfer of symbolic legitimacy, a moment where centuries of continuity are reaffirmed in front of the world. But reports suggest that this time, certain elements may not have unfolded exactly as expected. Various interpretations of the ceremony began to surface almost immediately, with some insiders whispering that the traditional order had been quietly reshaped. Not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm the public, but just enough to raise questions among those who knew what to look for. Palace aides were quick to dismiss any concerns, describing them as misinterpretations or over-analysis. They emphasized the importance of modernization, of adapting ancient traditions to a contemporary audience. And on the surface, that explanation seemed reasonable. After all, the monarchy has always evolved, always adjusted its image to survive the pressures of a changing world. But the whispers did not fade. In fact, they grew louder, because this did not feel like simple modernization. It felt, to some, like something had been deliberately streamlined, perhaps even omitted. Royal historians, typically cautious in their language, began to hint at inconsistencies. Nothing direct, nothing definitive, but enough to suggest that the ceremony might not have followed the full weight of tradition. Insiders claim that discussions about these changes had taken place long before the coronation day, quietly negotiated behind palace walls, far from public scrutiny. And that is where the unease truly began to take hold, because if changes were made, then someone approved them. And if someone approved them, then the question becomes unavoidable: what exactly was changed and why? As the days passed, what had started as a fleeting observation transformed into a persistent undercurrent of doubt, not loud enough to dominate headlines, but strong enough to linger in conversations among those closest to the institution. And in a monarchy built on symbolism, perception, and continuity, even a whisper can carry the weight of a storm waiting to break, because the issue was no longer about a single moment in a ceremony. It was about what that moment represented, and whether it truly upheld the traditions it was meant to honor. But what began as quiet unease inside the abbey soon unraveled into something far more serious, because the truth wasn't just about a ceremony. It was about legitimacy itself. For centuries, every crown placed upon a royal head followed a sacred blueprint, unchanged, unquestioned, and fiercely protected. Yet as historians began revisiting the coronation records, one unsettling realization emerged: parts of that blueprint may have been quietly rewritten. The deeper one looks into the traditions of a queen consort's coronation. The more it becomes clear that this is not simply ceremony, it is validation, transformation, and acceptance, all bound into one sacred sequence. Every movement, every word, every pause carries a meaning shaped over generations. At the center of it all lies the authority of the Church, particularly the role of the Church of England, which oversees the anointing process, arguably the most critical and symbolic moment of the entire ritual. It is here, in that sacred act, that a royal figure is not just crowned in title, but acknowledged in spirit, bound to the institution in a way that transcends politics and power. Historically, this process has been treated as untouchable. When Queen Elizabeth II underwent her coronation, every step was executed with meticulous precision, following a structure that had been preserved for centuries. There were no shortcuts. no reinterpretations, no quiet adjustments. It was a performance of continuity, a reassurance to the nation that nothing essential had changed. And that is why what is being suggested now feels so significant. Because if even one part of that sacred sequence was altered even slightly, it challenges the very foundation on which royal legitimacy stands. Reports suggest that during the most recent coronation, certain elements may have been shortened or subtly modified. Nothing overt, nothing that would disrupt the overall flow, but enough to spark concern among those who understand the weight behind each ritual. Various interpretations of the ceremony have begun to circulate, with some insiders whispering that the traditional order was streamlined in the name of modern relevance. Others suggest that certain symbolic acts may not have carried the same emphasis as they once did, raising questions about whether the full depth of the ritual was preserved. This is where the tension begins to intensify, because within the world of monarchy, modernization is always presented as progress, but to traditionalists, it can feel like erosion. Royal experts have quietly debated whether what took place was a necessary evolution or an uncomfortable omission. Was this a careful adaptation designed to align the monarchy with a modern audience? Or was it something more calculated, a deliberate reshaping of tradition to fit a new narrative? Insiders claim that these discussions were not spontaneous. They were the result of careful planning, long before the ceremony itself. And that is what makes this moment so charged with uncertainty. Because if the blueprint was indeed adjusted, then it was not an accident. It was a decision, a choice made behind closed doors, away from public scrutiny, carried out with precision and intent. And as these questions continue to surface, the implications begin to stretch far beyond a single ceremony. Because in a system where symbolism defines authority, even the smallest change can echo louder than the crown itself. What was meant to reaffirm tradition now risks reopening it for interpretation, leaving behind a trail of doubt that refuses to fade. And if those traditions were altered, the next question became unavoidable: who approved the changes? And more importantly, why? Behind closed palace doors, decisions were made long before the public ever saw the crown. Meetings were held, documents were revised, and according to insiders, not everyone in the royal circle agreed with what was about to unfold. Long before the ceremony reached the world stage, a quieter, more calculated process was already in motion. Reports suggest that a series of internal planning meetings took place deep within palace corridors, far removed from the ceremonial grandeur that would later define the public narrative. These were not ordinary preparations. They were strategic discussions, shaped by competing visions of what the monarchy should represent in a rapidly changing world. And within those discussions, tensions began to surface, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore for those close enough to feel them. Various interpretations of these meetings describe a divide among senior figures. On one side were those who believed the coronation should remain untouched, a direct continuation of centuries-old tradition. On the other, voices advocating for a more modern approach, one that would present the monarchy as adaptable, streamlined, and in step with contemporary expectations. At the center of this delicate balance stood Prince William, whose position, according to insiders, carried both influence and quiet restraint. He was not alone in navigating this divide, but his presence underscored the weight of what was at stake: not just a ceremony, but the future tone of the institution itself. Insiders whisper that certain traditions were not simply reconsidered, but intentionally scaled down, not removed entirely, but adjusted in ways that would be difficult for the public to detect. The language used in these internal conversations reportedly framed these changes as necessary, even a responsible effort to make the ceremony more accessible, more relevant, less burdened by layers of complexity that modern audiences might not fully understand. But yet, for those who view the monarchy as a structure built on ritual precision, even the smallest adjustment can feel like a fracture in something far more permanent. And that is where the narrative begins to shift, because what is presented as streamlining to one group can be perceived as erosion to another. Royal experts, observing from the outside, have quietly debated whether these choices were driven by practicality or something more strategic. Was this about simplifying a ceremony for clarity? Or was it about reshaping perception, subtly guiding how the monarchy is seen, understood, and ultimately accepted? The growing tension between modernization and tradition did not erupt into open conflict. It rarely does in a system built on restraint and discretion. Instead, it lingered beneath the surface, influencing decisions, shaping outcomes, and leaving behind traces that only now are beginning to be questioned. Because when multiple perspectives converge on a moment as significant as a coronation, the final result is never accidental. It is the product of negotiation, compromise, and, at times, quiet disagreement. As these layers begin to unfold, the focus shifts from what happened during the ceremony to what was decided long before it. The crown may have been placed in full view of the world, but the choices that defined that moment were made in private, guided by competing priorities and unseen pressures. And as more details emerge, the narrative becomes increasingly complex, revealing a story not just of tradition, but of influence, intention, and control. But the deeper investigators looked, the more it became clear this wasn't just about simplifying a ceremony, it was about controlling the narrative. What happens when a crown is placed but questions remain about how it got there? As whispers grew louder, a new and dangerous word began surfacing within royal circles: legitimacy. At first, the public reaction appeared unwavering. The coronation had delivered what people expected: tradition, grandeur, continuity. For many, the moment felt complete, unquestionable, sealed by ceremony and spectacle. But beneath that surface, a different current was beginning to form. Reports suggest that while the wider audience embraced the event without hesitation, those closer to the institution were far less certain. Insiders whisper that conversations behind closed doors carried a different tone: measured, cautious, and quietly uneasy. It was not outrage that defined these discussions, but something far more unsettling: doubt. The media, for its part, seemed reluctant to challenge the official narrative. Coverage remained largely celebratory, reinforcing the image of unity and success. Yet within that silence, some began to notice what was not being said. Various interpretations of the event were carefully framed, avoiding direct confrontation while leaving space for subtle questioning. It is in these spaces between what is declared and what is implied that uncertainty often takes root. Because when a story feels too controlled, too precise, it invites a different kind of scrutiny. Royal historians, known for their restraint, began to shift their language in small but significant ways. Not accusations, not declarations, but observations. Careful reflections on the difference between what was seen and what was expected. Some pointed to the distinction between a symbolic crowning and a fully realized traditional validation. On the surface, both may appear identical. The crown is placed. The ceremony concludes. The title is assumed. But beneath that, the question lingers: was every step that gives that moment its deeper meaning fully honored, or was something quietly redefined? This is where the concept of legitimacy becomes more than a word, it becomes a force. Because in a monarchy, authority is not just inherited, it is reinforced through ritual. It is built on the perception that every tradition has been upheld, every symbol respected, every expectation fulfilled. And when that perception begins to shift, even slightly, the impact can be profound. Insiders claim that this is precisely what began to unfold in the weeks following the coronation. Not a public crisis, but a private recalibration of how that moment was understood. The weight of perception is something the monarchy has always navigated with precision. It is not enough for something to be done, it must be seen to be done in a way that aligns with history. And when that alignment is questioned, the consequences ripple outward. Public trust, once shaken, does not collapse overnight. It erodes gradually, shaped by small uncertainties that accumulate over time. And that is what makes this moment so significant. Because the questions being raised are not loud, but they are persistent. And persistence, in matters of legacy, can be far more powerful than noise. As these doubts continue to circulate, the narrative becomes increasingly fragile. What was once presented as a definitive moment now exists in a space of interpretation, where meaning is no longer fixed but debated. And in that space, legitimacy becomes something that must be defended, reinforced, and perhaps even redefined. And just as the questions began to reach the surface, something unexpected happened. Voices within the establishment started to shift. Not all battles are fought in public. Some unfold in silence, behind polite smiles and carefully staged appearances. But beneath that surface, insiders suggest a divide was quietly forming, one that could reshape the future of the monarchy. In the weeks that followed the coronation, The atmosphere within the royal household began to shift in ways that were almost imperceptible to the outside world. There were no dramatic confrontations, no visible fractures, no statements that hinted at discord. Instead, what emerged were subtle changes, small adjustments in tone, in presence, in the way certain moments were handled. Reports suggest that those closest to the institution began to sense an undercurrent of tension, not loud enough to disrupt the image of unity, but strong enough to be felt in private exchanges and unspoken reactions. At the heart of this quiet divide were two competing visions of what the monarchy should represent moving forward. On one side stood those who believed deeply in the preservation of tradition, who saw the institution not as something to be reshaped, but as something to be protected in its purest form. On the other side were voices advocating for adaptation, for a monarchy that could evolve with the times, shedding what they viewed as unnecessary complexity in favor of broader relevance. It was not a clash of personalities, it was a clash of philosophies. And in a system built on continuity, even a philosophical divide can carry profound consequences. Within this landscape, Catherine, Princess of Wales, began to take on a symbolic role that extended far beyond her public appearances. Insiders whisper that her approach, measured, disciplined, and deeply rooted in protocol, came to represent a certain vision of stability. She was seen, in many interpretations, as someone who understood the weight of tradition not as a burden, but as a responsibility. And in contrast, the evolving perception of Queen Camilla's role began to draw increasing scrutiny, particularly among those who questioned whether the recent shifts in ceremonial practice aligned with the monarchy's historical foundations. Various interpretations of these dynamics suggest that differing views on Camilla's position were not openly expressed, but quietly acknowledged. It was not about rejection or acceptance, it was about interpretation, about how her role was defined, how it was presented, and how it was understood within the broader narrative of royal continuity. And while the palace maintained a carefully unified front, insiders claimed that these internal conversations were far more complex than they appeared. Publicly, everything remained composed. Appearances were coordinated, messaging was consistent, and the image of cohesion was preserved with precision. The monarchy has always understood the importance of perception, and in moments of uncertainty, that understanding becomes even more critical. But beneath that controlled exterior, the idea persisted that what was being presented was not the full story, that behind the scenes there were conversations that could not be shared, perspectives that could not be openly discussed, and disagreements that had to remain carefully contained. And that is where the true weight of the situation begins to emerge. Because when differences are managed rather than resolved, they do not disappear, they deepen. They become part of the structure itself, influencing decisions in ways that are not immediately visible. Insiders suggest that this is precisely what began to happen as the monarchy moved forward while carrying an unresolved tension beneath its surface. But divisions alone don't change history. What mattered was what came next and who would ultimately define the truth. When questions begin to spiral, the palace does what it has always done best: control the story. But in the age of relentless scrutiny, even the most carefully managed narrative can start to crack. In the immediate aftermath of rising speculation, the response was swift, calculated, and unmistakably deliberate. Reports suggest that communication channels were quietly aligned, messaging refined, and a clear narrative reinforced across every public-facing platform. The coronation, it was emphasized, had been conducted with dignity, precision, and full adherence to tradition. Official statements echoed a consistent theme: continuity had been preserved. The ceremony had fulfilled its purpose, and any suggestion otherwise was simply a misunderstanding. It was a familiar strategy, one the monarchy has relied on for generations. Project certainty, eliminate ambiguity, and allow confidence to silence doubt. But in moments like this, control is never absolute, because while official messaging can shape perception, it cannot fully contain curiosity. Critics who attempted to question the process found themselves subtly dismissed, their concerns reframed as speculation or misinterpretation. Various interpretations of their arguments were reduced to noise, positioned as distractions rather than legitimate inquiries. And yet, the more these voices were pushed aside, the more persistent they became. Not louder, but sharper, more focused, as if the very act of dismissal had given them new momentum. At the heart of this struggle lies a fundamental tension between image and process. The imagery of the coronation, the crown, The ceremony, the symbolism remains powerful, almost untouchable in its ability to command belief. For many, that image is enough. It defines reality. But for others, particularly those who understand the deeper layers of royal tradition, the process matters just as much as the outcome. Insiders whisper that it is within this gap between what is seen and what is known that uncertainty begins to grow. Because when the visual narrative feels complete, but the procedural narrative feels questioned, the result is not clarity, it is tension. And in today's landscape, that tension does not remain contained. Social media, with its constant flow of interpretation and analysis, has transformed how these moments are understood. What once might have remained confined to private discussions now spreads rapidly, shaped by countless perspectives, each adding a new layer to the story. Some interpretations are measured, grounded in historical comparison. Others are more speculative, driven by emotion and suspicion. But together, they create something the palace cannot fully control: a shifting narrative that evolves in real time, beyond the reach of official statements. As this alternative narrative grows, so too does the gap between what is being presented and what is being questioned. It is not a collapse of trust, not yet. But it is a subtle shift, a growing awareness that the story may be more complex than it appears. And once that awareness takes hold, it becomes difficult to reverse, because curiosity, once awakened, rarely settles back into silence. The monarchy, built on the power of perception, now finds itself navigating a moment where perception is no longer singular. It is fragmented, layered, and increasingly influenced by forces outside its control. And in that fragmentation lies the true challenge: not just maintaining authority, but maintaining belief. And as the narrative tightened, one final question refused to disappear: if everything was done correctly, why did it feel like something was being hidden? Sometimes, the truth isn't a single revelation, it's a collection of details that refuse to align. And when those details are placed side by side, they begin to tell a story the palace never intended to be heard. By now, the questions surrounding the coronation had evolved into something more intricate, more layered, and far more difficult to dismiss. It was no longer about one moment or one perceived deviation, it was about a pattern. A sequence of subtle inconsistencies that, when viewed in isolation, seemed insignificant, but when connected, began to form a narrative that felt impossible to ignore. Reports suggest that experts who revisited the ceremony with a more analytical lens started to notice these patterns emerging, not as clear evidence of wrongdoing, but as signals that something had been adjusted. Various interpretations of these adjustments describe them as unusual, a word carefully chosen to avoid direct accusation, while still acknowledging that what occurred did not fully align with established expectations. Some insiders whisper that these changes were deliberate, part of a broader effort to reshape how the monarchy presents itself in a modern era. Others suggest a more cautious explanation: that the ceremony evolved naturally, adapting to circumstances that required flexibility. And yet, it is within this ambiguity that the tension grows strongest. Because the line between evolution and deviation is not always clear, and once that line is questioned, it becomes difficult to define. For the public, the understanding of royal rituals often exists at a surface level, shaped by symbolism and tradition rather than detailed knowledge. The crown is placed, the ceremony concludes, and the moment is accepted as complete. But behind that simplicity lies a far more complex structure, one that insiders and historians understand in depth. And it is within that deeper understanding that the current uncertainty takes hold. And because what appears seamless on the surface can feel fragmented when examined more closely, revealing gaps that are not easily explained. The mystery surrounding what may have been altered continues to linger, not because it has been proven, but because it has not been fully addressed. Insiders claim that discussions about these inconsistencies remain confined to private circles, where they can be debated without disrupting the official narrative. And perhaps that is where they will remain, because in an institution built on continuity and perception, acknowledging uncertainty can be far more destabilizing than allowing it to quietly exist. This is what gives the situation its enduring weight. Not the presence of definitive answers, but the absence of them. The possibility that the full truth, whatever it may be, could remain just out of reach, hinted at but never confirmed. And in that space, speculation thrives, not as reckless imagination, but as a response to unanswered questions that continue to surface, again and again, refusing to fade. As these details accumulate, the story they tell becomes increasingly difficult to contain. It is no longer shaped solely by official statements or controlled narratives, but by the collective effort to understand what truly happened. And while that understanding may never be complete, its impact is already unfolding, quietly influencing how the coronation is remembered, interpreted, and ultimately judged. But even without official confirmation, the impact of those questions was already being felt, and the monarchy itself would have to carry the weight of them. A crown is more than gold and jewels. It is history, authority, and trust. And when even a shadow of doubt is cast upon it, the consequences don't fade, they linger. For Queen Camilla, the moment that was meant to define her place in history now carries a dual weight, one of triumph and one of quiet, persistent questioning. On the surface, her legacy is secured. The crown was placed, the title affirmed, the role accepted by the institution she had spent years stepping into. But beneath that certainty lies something far more complex. Because legacy in a monarchy is not only shaped by what is declared, it is shaped by what is believed. And belief, once unsettled, does not easily return to its original form. The monarchy itself has always depended on a delicate balance between tradition and trust. It is not sustained by power alone, but by the perception that every tradition has been honored without compromise, that every ritual carries the same weight it always has. And when even a small uncertainty enters that equation, it begins to ripple outward. Reports suggest that this is where the true impact of the coronation questions begins to take hold, not in immediate reaction, but in long-term interpretation. Because history does not settle in the moment. It evolves, shaped by those who revisit it, question it, and ultimately redefine it. Unanswered questions have a way of embedding themselves into the narrative of events. They do not disappear. They linger in the margins, waiting to be revisited by future generations who will look back not with emotion, but with analysis. And in that process, the meaning of the coronation may shift. What was once seen as a definitive moment could become a subject of debate, a point of interpretation rather than certainty. Insiders whisper that this is the quiet reality. The monarchy now faces not a crisis, but a gradual transformation of how that moment will be remembered. Future generations will play a critical role in this evolution. They will not experience the event as it unfolded, but as it is recorded, discussed, and understood over time. And their perception will not be shaped solely by official accounts, but by the questions that continue to surround it. Because in an age where information is constantly revisited and re-examined, no moment remains fixed. Everything is subject to reinterpretation. Everything can be seen from a different angle. And yet, despite all of this, the power of the crown endures. Symbolism, after all, is not easily undone. It carries a force that extends beyond individual moments, beyond specific ceremonies, beyond even the doubts that may surround them. The monarchy has survived centuries of change precisely because it understands how to hold on to that symbolism, how to preserve its meaning even as the world around it shifts. But preservation does not mean immunity. It does not mean that questions cannot leave their mark. What remains now is not a clear resolution, but a lasting tension between what was seen and what is being questioned, between the certainty that was presented and the uncertainty that continues to surface. And within that tension lies the true weight of the moment, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed narratives can carry unseen fractures. Because in the end, the question isn't just whether Queen Camilla was crowned properly, it's whether the truth behind that moment will ever fully come to light. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.